When Heraclitus is talking about a kind of fire that's ever changing in its forms and that represents the fundamental dynamic energy of the cosmos and that can never be entirely stabilized, contained, or controlled, this is the substrate that careful attention to the paranormal reveals. Implicitly, it's legitimate to see this undercurrent of chaos as exactly what Nietzsche meant by the becoming that expresses itself as the perspectival struggle between different forms of life, each motivated by their will to power. You see that Plato actually thinks that the entire rational endeavor of training your mind to perceive and think in terms of the forms is a preparatory exercise that's intended to catalyze an irrational intuition of the beautiful that's essentially erotic. Eros is the beating heart of Nietzsche's work. It will involve every form of warfare, externally, internally, and ultimately spiritual warfare. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. There's no way around that.
Salvete Legionaries, I have a very, very special recurring guest back for the third time on the Warrior Philosopher podcast, Jason REZA Jorjani, here today to talk about not just a new book, but also the first book that he is publishing with us, our very own at DVX Publishing with Lance Legion and I. So it's a very exciting day. We're going to be talking about fundamental thinkers today. And before we get into that, Jason, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. How have you been since the last time we spoke?
Well, since the last time we spoke, Patrick, I have been in the hell of the most mismanaged war in the history of the United States, which is considering Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan is saying a lot. But that's not the subject of our conversation. It's just by way of honestly answering your question, which is that as someone who worked for the freedom and liberation of the Iranian people for decades, at least 20 years, I have just been utterly appalled at what I've seen from out of the Trump administration over the last 4 months now. So that's where I've been, and I haven't done podcasts in that time. But here we are back at it with the release of Fundamental Thinkers by the press that you and Lance Legion run, DVX. And I'm very happy to be back with you, and I'm happy to be working with you.
As are we and Lance. It's an honor to have you with us. And I guess that goes right into my first question is, well, why did you feel the need to write this book, and why now?
You know, it's interesting. I put out these 2 volumes about a year ago, Philosophy of the Future and Metapolemos, which were a kind of grand synthesis that could be read either as an introduction to my entire corpus or as a kind of summary of all of my original philosophical concepts. And one of those books, Philosophy of the Future, is laid out in terms of the original concepts. The other one, Metapolemos, was broken up in terms of different domains of philosophy, which I want to get into a little bit shortly. In other words, ontology, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and politics. And so the publication of those 2 twin volumes, the cover art of those is very much, very similar to each other, and they're meant to be twin volumes, marked a kind of culmination of a certain phase in my philosophical work. And so it makes sense in a way to go back to the fundamental thinkers after that. There's a point at which no matter how sophisticated your thinking becomes and to what extent your philosophical project involves radical departures from, I don't want to say the tradition, but let's say canonical thought, it becomes all the more important to come back to the foundations, especially if one is open to new avenues of contemplation unfolding and potential reorientations in one's thinking. It's always good to come back to the fundamental thinkers. And the other reason I wrote it is, related to something that's motivated me throughout my entire philosophical career, which is that in light of the superficiality and groundlessness of what passes for thought in postmodernity, the basic ideas and fundamental contributions of the great philosophers can never be overly belabored. They really need to serve as an anchor for a reclamation and reorientation of our civilization. So I had addressed some of the major thinkers in the history of philosophy, both in grounding works of mine like Prometheus and Atlas, and also in an earlier collection of essays called Lovers of Sophia. But it wasn't in the crystallized form of essentially a textbook that it is in this volume. I mean, this volume, Fundamental Thinkers, is kind of like the Jorjani textbook on the history of philosophy. And to be honest with you, the genesis of this particular project was that, I've privately, in the years since I've been defamed into unemployability in academia, I have privately taught a few people philosophy, including some very high-level people. At one point, I was teaching a tech innovator billionaire privately. And so anyway, there was a moment where I had to come up with a essentially textbook on the history of philosophy that involved, let's say, 20 questions on the ontology, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics of all the major thinkers. And so I had a lot of notes for that, and wound up synthesizing them and recompiling them into this series of essays. These essays on Heraclitus, Plato, Aristotle, Comte, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. And in that backbone of the history of philosophy, the one thing that probably will stand out is Comte. Like, why would I pick this guy Comte, who generally is taught in sociology courses, and even then with contempt these days because he was a grand synthetic thinker? God forbid, that he should aspire to some, master narrative and grand system. So he's mostly taught in sociology departments. But if you look at the structure of Auguste Comte's thought, there's no question that this man is more of a philosopher than René Descartes, especially considering the fact that on top of Descartes never developing a political philosophy or really any aesthetics worthy of the name, Descartes was literally a paid agent of the Jesuit order. I laid this out in Prometheus and Atlas in the chapter Reason and Terror of my first book, Prometheus and Atlas. I essentially went into Descartes' biography and revealed that this man was a military intelligence officer sent by the Jesuit order to derail the development of early Enlightenment thought from out of the Renaissance in a direction that would reify a false dichotomy between, a mechanistic materialist world that's soulless and the completely abstracted, deracinated notion of mind. And the reason that he did this was to basically inculcate a sense of despair with a view to rationalism in the intellectual population and sequester anything having to do with meaning and spiritual value within the domain of the church, so that the church, whose power was then very much threatened by, alchemists and occult thinkers of the Renaissance, will continue to have a monopoly on anything having to do with the mind or the soul. and so that science would be crippled through an artificially reductive materialism and mechanistic world model. So Descartes is a bad actor, and therefore he does not appear as the first representative of modern thought in this volume. A different Frenchman does, and that's Auguste Comte, who, by the way, had a very, and we can come back to this later in the context of political philosophy, Comte had a very tangible social and political impact, in particular on the development of the Brazilian Republic. His ideas were not, didn't remain in an ivory tower of intellectual speculation and abstraction. He actually had a revolutionary impact on sociopolitics in a significant part of the world.
And I think the question of what is philosophy is going to be important. And to sort of build into that question, what I wanted to ask you, you mentioned some other integral thinkers that weren't included in this edition. And I believe they were Henri Bergson, William James, and Ludwig Wittgenstein. So what I wanted to sort of ask you was, were there any other instrumental thinkers that you did not mention in this book who maybe weren't philosophers? And then how does that relate to this whole question of what constitutes a philosopher, especially in the book where you sort of mention ontology, epistemology, and aesthetics, and having a position on those being key to being able to consider yourself a philosopher?
Yeah, excellent question. So you somewhat misremembered something, which is a good thing, because the fact that you framed this way allows me to offer more illuminating clarifications. And that's that what I said about Bergson, James, and Wittgenstein in the first chapter of this book, which is sort of an introduction to what it means to be a philosopher and what counts for philosophy, namely the philosopher's task. What I said about William James, Henri Bergson, and Ludwig Wittgenstein in that intro is that there are three thinkers who had a very deep impact on me that I didn't include because, at least in the case of James and Bergson, there's serious reason to question whether they can be considered philosophers. Why? William James was an absolutely brilliant psychologist. He also was a deep metaphysical thinker. And James's ontology of a pluralistic universe, what he called a pluralistic universe, in other words, a cosmos that has multiple centers of force and substantively differentiated loci of agency, okay, where it's not the case, as in materialism, that all agency is reducible to a series of fundamental laws acting on dead matter, nor is it the case that everything is ultimately an illusion insofar as it's differentiated and has any individual identity and particular qualities, and that the one true thing is sort of a singular object of a mind that is the same thing as that object, namely, an idea of which all putative objects and things in the world are sort of dissociated refractions, right? Which is what you get in idealism. In both of those accounts of the world, namely materialism and idealism, you don't really have any differentiated and authentic agency on the part of beings. Whereas in James's account of a pluralistic universe, which hopefully we'll come to in a while, overlaps with Heraclitus and with Nietzsche's ontology of the will to power. And that's very much the way in which I had read James, because by the time I was reading William James, I had already read Heraclitus and was deeply familiar with Nietzsche and already being influenced by Nietzsche. And so I saw William James in terms of Heraclitus, sort of a part of a triad in terms of his ontology with Heraclitus and with Nietzsche. So he developed a very exceptional ontology. And Insofar as William James was one of the founders of psychical research and did actual laboratory experiments in what would later be called parapsychology, on top of his work as a psychologist, which was extensive, you can also see an epistemology in William James, which, winds up being referred to as pragmatism, and also radical empiricism. I mean, the two different terms one could use for James's epistemology are pragmatism and/or radical empiricism. So he's an ontological and epistemic thinker. And then, James even has a very serious contributions to make to ethics, where, again, one of the aspects of his thought that I most resonated with, because I implicitly agreed with it, and that then also, therefore, allowed me to unpack my own thoughts in this regard more systematically, was the centrality of free will in James's ethics, and his fairly systematic argument for what kind of ontological structure and what kind of epistemic method is consonant with an ethic structured around free will. In other words, what kind of a cosmos and what conception of knowledge allows us any degree of agency at all, any degree of personal responsibility, and recognition of ourselves as contributors to the course of events in the cosmos, right? So he has all of this. But for reasons that it's good to unpack here, he can't be considered a philosopher because he has no political philosophy. And in the case of James, this is really catastrophic because he was a pacifist. And this is one of those cases where you look at someone who's so brilliant in many ways, and then you're just like, what the fuck? Like, how could you, not see that pacifism is completely at odds with your entire ontology and epistemology and your ethical commitment to free will, right? William James should have had a politics that would have aligned with Nietzsche's. Or, to go back to the foundations of philosophy, with the political views of Heraclitus. He should have had an agonistic political philosophy based on polemos and on differentiation and struggle, and its constructive value, since creativity and innovation were so important to James. But he winds up being a pacifist. And what this shows you is that until and unless you question any presuppositions or assumptions that you have in any major domain of human thought and activity, you're not a philosopher. I mean, not even close. So the way I define the task of a philosopher from the very beginning of this text is that taking Plato and Aristotle as exemplary, and the pre-Socratics as a embryonic phase that gestates the thought of Plato and Aristotle, we see that the philosopher is someone who's concerned with truth, beauty, and justice, and the integral interconnections between them. Okay? Now later, after Aristotle and the degree of systematic complexity that's formalized through Aristotle's thinking, you can express this commitment to fundamental contemplation and conceptual formation in terms of truth, beauty, and justice. You can restructure that in a more disciplined and sophisticated way with a view to the domains of ontology, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and politics, where sort of like ontology and epistemology have to do with truth, ethics and aesthetics maybe has to do with beauty, and then ethics and political philosophy have to do with justice, right? And one's thinking in all of these domains, again, should be coherent and cohesive. And that's not an arbitrary criteria. The reason why it's a legitimate criteria is because if you have any unquestioned presuppositions or tacit commitments in any one of these domains, it's going to warp your thinking in the other ones. So, and expose you to, vulnerabilities that are unnecessary, where the, systematic character of your thought can be taken apart based on, tacit commitments to an unexamined politics that have been smuggled into your metaphysics or epistemology. Like for example, let's say that somebody has a tacit political commitment to the equality of all human beings, which for them remains unquestioned because they do no work in the area of political thought. And because of this tacit commitment to the equality of all human beings, in other words, we're all born and created equal, right? This person, as an epistemologist, or even thinking ontologically about human nature, will never take seriously any empirical evidence in favor of radical differentiation within the human species. And that's a very serious way in which a philosopher could fall short, right? Because, it has all kinds of implications in terms of your theory of mind, your understanding of the essence of human being or the lack thereof, right? These are all, and it's coming from an unexamined political assumption that you have, an unexamined political commitment, rather, that you have. So that's in terms of William James. Now, relatedly, in terms of Henri Bergson, Bergson's thinking is actually much more comprehensive than James. Obviously, he was a first-rate thinker in terms of ontology and epistemology. Look at works like Matter and Memory and Creative Evolution, and they're absolutely brilliant ontologically and epistemically. But then he also has an ethics that he develops and two sources of religion and morality. And there's also a sort of at least implicit aesthetic orientation in Bergson's writing. And then in the domain of politics, Henri Bergson actually was one of the founders of UNESCO, what became eventually United Nations Educational and Cultural Organization, Scientific Educational and Cultural Organization. Back in the days when it was part of the League of Nations, Bergson contributed to that significantly. And so he has kind of a political, at least implicit political project in his life that involves a certain notion of world government and so forth. But here's a big problem with Henri Bergson. He converted to Christianity. As someone coming from a Jewish background, he saw it necessary for the sake of his immortal soul to convert to Christianity. Okay? Well, as I argue, in this volume, toward the beginning, and really it should go without saying, but unfortunately it doesn't, you cannot have a faith commitment and be a philosopher. The fundamental character of adherence to any religious faith is that you unquestionably adopt a certain doctrine, that you, without question, commit yourself to a certain creed, that you take as fundamental and unquestionable presuppositions certain articles of faith. Philosophy begins in a revolt against that. Okay? The Pythagorean schools were burned down in Sicily because Pythagoras threatened the traditional religious culture of that society. Socrates was charged with impiety, with denying the gods of the state, and thereby corrupting the minds of the youth. Okay, he was executed over essentially heresy. All right. And Heraclitus, who I get into in the first chapter of this book, Fundamental Thinkers, and I remark on this explicitly, Heraclitus levels a scathing critique at the Homeric religion of the Greeks and was very impressed by Persian spirituality, Zarathustra's philosophy, but also, I think, Mithraism. And he wound up, facing persecution and increasingly severe alienation. And finally, after the democratic revolt of the Ephesians against the Persian Empire, he sequestered himself in the temple of Artemis and never came out. Now, one might superficially interpret that as a religious act, but the name Artemis in the original ancient Iranian, in the Sarmatian language and Old Persian, means truth the immortal. And I think that if you really read between the lines of Heraclitus's fragments, you can understand in what way he embraced Artemis as a symbol. And it's not religious. It's philosophical in the sense of the very inception of what philosophy means in contradistinction to religion. Heraclitus's God is wisdom, ultimately, and a certain deathless truth that abides through all change in the cosmos. And he very explicitly takes aim at ignorant religious beliefs, various, Homeric folk tales, and the cult practices that the masses adhere to that are associated with them. So, right from the beginning of the history of philosophy, even in its embryonic pre-Socratic phase, you have this revolt against traditional religion. And then Plato comes along and engages in such a radical critique of the Homeric, Hesiodic religion of the Greeks that he has the audacity to propose that philosophers create a religion for the masses to believe in that would be more conducive to the cultivation of the ethical fiber of the youth, which is just about the most heretical thing you could possibly propose. The idea that a bunch of, super intellectuals are going to take religion away from people, the religion that they believe in, and they're going to teach these people's kids to believe in a religion that's been designed by these philosophers that doesn't consist of true claims, but consists of constructive fables, constructive recastings of folklore, and mythically framed ideas that will be more conducive to the psychological and social development of people than the garbage that they inherited from their forefathers as the traditional religion of their society. Okay? So, from its foundation, philosophy was fundamentally opposed to religion. And by the way, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I also don't include in this volume, because not only is Rousseau not a philosopher, Rousseau is a political theorist who is explicitly anti-philosophical. And he writes, I believe it was in his Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, that the execution of Socrates was justified because every society needs what Rousseau calls, this is what Rousseau argues, I'm not endorsing it, every society needs what Rousseau calls a civic religion. And the only way you can have a democracy is for the demos to be bound together, at least implicitly, by a shared civic religion. And Socrates threatened the civic religion of Athens, and therefore he deserved to die. I mean, Rousseau argues this as the first great modern proponent of democracy. So this is another thing that we can get to down the line, but I want to see what other questions you have. And another thing we can get to down the line is, this deep problem that philosophers seem to have had with democracy from, Pythagoras and Heraclitus and Plato onward. But yeah, let's return to the arc of your questions.
And we'll definitely return to Plato because I do have some questions that I wrote, which I think overlap a lot with sort of what you're saying. I had a quick funny thing I wanted to bring up from our first conversation. I had meant to mention the name Sorel. I'm just remembering it right now because you're talking about the political project of Henri Bergson. And largely, I think a lot of the politics of George Sorel is a direct result of his reading of vitalism and Elan Vital within Bergson's works. So it's funny, in our original conversation, I meant to bring up Sorel and I said Stiegler. And another funny thing is I had not read Bataille yet, so I had said his name Bataille or Batile or something like that. So just two funny things I remember from our first conversation that I wanted to remember. But back to the questions and sort of what I wanted to ask you next in regards to going back a little bit, because I wanted to go to Heraclitus because I know that he's very integral to a lot of the thinking. I think really in regards to even Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. And what I wanted to ask you was, and I wrote this down, so conflict seems sort of integral to either a dialectic synthesis in the case of Hegel or the evolution of being in the works of Nietzsche and Heidegger. And they all have a debt to this Heraclitean conception of war as the father of all. And you focused on this at length in books like Metapolemos, but I wanted to get into how you incorporated and then built upon your own original philosophy from Heraclitus's conception of strife as sort of the driver of history and becoming.
So before I answer the last part of the question, which is really, that's the gravity well of the question, let me unpack the first part of your question and the way that you framed it. It's true that one of the deepest and most enduring, long-running influences that at least several of these thinkers have had on me, I'd say 4 of them, has to do with this idea of a fundamental conflict of substantively differentiated forces at work in the cosmos, so that the cosmos has no overarching, all-unifying manifold, nor is it of one substance that can be grasped by any mind. In other words, there's no Brahman, to speak in Hindu terms, that's going to have a mind that's a mirror to the totality of the cosmos, nor can any Atman, again, to speak in Hindu terms, nor can any microcosm of the human soul ever evolve to the point of identity with some Brahman so that our limited consciousness could become an infinite consciousness that could grasp the entire cosmos or somehow intuit the way in which it is already one with the entire cosmos. This is a notion which was present in the embryonic thought of the Eleatics, particularly Parmenides, and that was rejected explicitly by Heraclitus, and I think rightfully so. And the idea that the cosmos is co-constituted by a plurality of forces that are in a state of dynamic tension with one another, where things come into be and pass away as part of an enduring conflict, is picked up by Hegel, who read Heraclitus very closely. And interestingly, despite the significant divergences between Hegel and Nietzsche, insofar as Hegel's conception of the dialectic is about the synthesis that is constructively emerging from out of various conflicts, from the ontological level all the way to the social level throughout the course of history. Heraclitus's process-oriented thinking, which again he owes to, Hegel's process-oriented thinking, which again he owes to Heraclitus, is aiming at synthesis, right? And eventually a kind of intuition of the whole, albeit a whole that's come into being through process and through a whole series of dialectical syntheses of relative oppositions, right? But despite this emphasis on synthesis and unification through time that you see in Hegel, Nietzsche, who has a completely opposed view that insists on the endurance of differentiation and the rejection of any ultimate reconciliation on any level, from the ontological to the political, still Hegel and Nietzsche are equally adopting and affirming the Heraclitean insight into the structure of the cosmos, and the way in which the human individual is agonistically situated with regard to other people and things and processes in the world. So, as divergent as Hegel and Nietzsche are in the history of modern thought, they share this Heraclitean inspiration. And then you see it continue in Heidegger, where, Heidegger has this, first of all, Heidegger's entire thought hinges on the insight that time is the horizon of being. In other words, that existence has to be interpreted in an epochal way where what it means to be changes with time. And so being is becoming. People often draw a very superficial distinction between Nietzsche and Heidegger, alleging that Nietzsche is a philosopher of becoming who rejects an idea of being, and that, Nietzsche's thought ultimately deconstructs being, existence qua, sein, in favor of an affirmation of becoming. And then Heidegger represents kind of return to thinking of being, right? Das Sein. And Dasein, the there being, the human being's relation to das Sein. And, how being and time begins, Heidegger's magnum opus, is with the return to the question of being and so forth, right? And so people think Heidegger's like a thinker of being, and he is sort of like reorienting philosophy after, Nietzsche went off into this mad Dionysian affirmation of becoming. It's not the case. If you read Heidegger deeply, you see that Heidegger is as much thinking of being as becoming as Nietzsche is. And that's what he means when he argues in favor of existence as determined by changes in time and epochal structures that shift. And they shift the whole matrix of interpretation for what exists and how we understand ourselves. Okay, both on an individual and a sociopolitical level. So Heidegger is therefore also a thinker of process, and in that sense a Heraclitean. But Heidegger, like Hegel, let's say in his master-slave dialectic, and like Nietzsche in his metaphysics of the will to power, Heidegger is also indebted to Heraclitus, or reaffirming and forwarding the trajectory of Heraclitus, insofar as he has this idea of worlds at war over the earth, so that what he calls the worldhood of the world, in other words, what gives meaning to things and people and what makes a place on earth for a particular community, is not the same from society to society. And this doesn't mean that different societies have subjective interpretations of an objectively existent world, and that, they are basically interpreting some really existent material world in different ways. No, there are actually no laws of nature, and there's no physical stability outside of the hermeneutic fabric of a particular people. And different peoples with their divergent folklores, the lore that structures the world of the folk, are at war with each other. They're in a state of fundamental conflict on an ontological level over the shape that the earth will take. And there are various endeavors to craft a world of meaning that's inspiring and purposeful from out of the earth. Okay? So, and this is a very bizarre notion for people who are coming from out of an analytic background, or people who unquestioningly have internalized the let's say, dogmas of materialist modern science. For these kinds of people, I mean, they look at these aspects of Heidegger's thinking and they think, he's some kind of a Bavarian, raving lunatic mystic in the Black Forest. But actually, what Heidegger is saying here is deeply consonant with what quantum theory discovered. And especially when you put quantum theory next to parapsychology, and this is bringing me to answering the ultimate, the upshot of your question, which is that these aspects of the thinking of Heraclitus and Hegel also, but especially Nietzsche and Heidegger, were adopted and appropriated by me as parts of my own philosophical project and catalysts for the development of original concepts of mine through my study of quantum theory, certain other, let's say, marginalized areas of scientific research, like Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance, and the intersection of these areas of edge science with parapsychology. So that when you take, and by the way, again, William James is relevant here as someone who did some philosophical work and also was a founder in parapsychology. When you take parapsychological research seriously and you understand it in terms of what quantum theory discovered about the relationship between physical phenomena and the observation of differentiated conscious beings, you realize that Heidegger is absolutely right, that there's no earth that's independently existent and that would subsist but for the worlds of various people who are trying to make the earth mean something to them. And it gets really like, you want to go deep into this in a maddening way, read Charles Fort and look at his conception of what he calls dominance, or prevailing structures of belief, whether they're scientific or religious, which change from epoch to epoch. Again, very much mirroring Heidegger's insight into the fact that time is the horizon of being and that time is epochal. And you come to understand that, but for the worlds of various peoples who are trying to inhabit this earth as a place, the earth doesn't exist at all. And on a larger scale, the cosmos wouldn't exist either, but for the fact that surely there are many other beings besides humans in the cosmos, and they're in a struggle with one another over the co-constitution of this cosmos from out of a kind of ontological chaos being shaped by their divergent and conflicting psyches on a social scale. So, in short, the answer to your question is that looking at the intersection between parapsychology and quantum theory helped me to understand the arc from Heraclitus to Heidegger in a more tangible way that was instrumental for my framing of concepts like the spectral revolution, being bound for freedom, which, by the way, is very Hegelian if you think about my concept of being bound, meaning the ontological finitude. That's also very Heideggerian, the finitude of being, the boundedness of existence, being bound, but being bound also in the sense of being directed toward, on a trajectory toward the teleology of existence as something that's aiming at freedom. It's very Hegelian. So these concepts like spectral revolution, being bound for freedom, also, I would say my idea of phenomenal authorization, or the way in which there's a relationship between how phenomena take shape and authorship considered on an ontological level, and then also the authority of a sovereign on a sociopolitical level. These ideas all took shape in a context where the philosophical ideas of, Heraclitus, Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger were filtered through the empirical research in quantum theory and parapsychology that rendered them much more tangible and relevant to me.
And on that note, I did want to get into more of sort of your views on Heidegger, or sorry, not Heidegger, Hegel. And I wrote some questions about this as well. And I think you'll sort of have an answer to what I'm sort of delving into. But when we read Hegel, a lot of people read Hegel, whether implicitly with the sort of backhanded reference, where Nietzsche never really references Hegel, but it seems in some ways that he is referencing certain Hegelian ideas, or whether it's explicitly with Deleuze. There's sort of sometimes this belief in Hegel being a logocentric determinist, where his conception of freedom is still constrained within the unfolding of the absolute. And I'm guilty of thinking this way in the past as well, but I've sort of been rereading Hegel, and also through some of your treatments of Hegel, where the function of dialectic synthesis is more so a fluxed becoming, and where the end of history isn't so much an end of history, but more so sort of, as you say, bound for freedom, bound towards a certain means of viewing the world, or mythology of viewing the world. And I was wondering where you sort of see the role of agency in Hegelian philosophy being less so deterministic, like a lot of the readings of Hegel have been, and more so being that end of history as that moment where we have this greater realization of freedom and being able to act then from that point.
I also, at one point, misread Hegel in this way under the influence of William James. Philosophers sometimes use other philosophers as straw men. I mean, Plato infamously did this to both Heraclitus and Parmenides. I discussed that in my essay on Plato in Fundamental Thinkers. And William James does it with Hegel. And I'd like to think that he's doing it on purpose. Maybe he just didn't read Hegel that deeply. But William James makes this argument that basically Hegel is a determinist, and that his dialectical synthesis of all apparent oppositions into some final state of totally transparent self-consciousness, which Hegel refers to as the absolute, that this essentially means that everything that ever happens was meant to happen, and that things had to unfold the way they did in order for this end state to be achieved. But actually, when you read Hegel more closely, you realize that there's no reason to have this kind of deterministic interpretation of his teleology. I think what Hegel's really saying is essentially that, for the most part, throughout history, we have been unconscious of the dynamics that shape our psychology and reshape societies. And this extends down to the level of the formation of scientific concepts, because Hegel is working across the entire spectrum from, fundamental concepts in physics and how they change over time. Basically, Hegel's like the first theoretician of paradigm shifts. What later Thomas Kuhn winds up calling paradigm shift, it's already there in an incipient form in Hegel. But all the way from that level of, the framing of basic scientific concepts up to the core structures of socio-political regimes. Hegel is saying that predominantly we have been unconscious of the forces that bring about often violent change in these structures over the course of history. We can become conscious of these forces and develop a more transparent cognizance of the structure of the dialectic that is responsible for development or progress over the course of time. And this process of increasing self-consciousness, which, by the way, also is an overcoming of the alienation that's a function of various forms of the master-slave dialectic, this process of increasing self-consciousness will bring us to a point which is the end of history, not in the sense that it's a be-all and end-all and anything that could ever happen has happened by then. No. And that everything that has happened to bring us to that point had to happen the way it happened. No. The point is, it's the end of history as an unconscious process. And therefore, it's also the actualization of freedom. This is why Hegel sees the end of history both as total self-consciousness and also as the achievement of freedom, because it's the point forth from which human beings will no longer be dominated by unconscious forces and dynamics that are only moving them subconsciously. And so therefore, from that moment onward, kind of our lives are freely determined, and history will mean something completely different from what it's meant in the past, which is an insight that Nietzsche is getting from Hegel. Like you said, whether he cites him explicitly or not. I mean, when Nietzsche says that for the Übermensch, history will mean something completely different than what it means for us, this is a Hegelian insight at the outset. I mean, this is what Hegel means when he's talking about life beyond the so-called end of history. And so, yeah, that's what I would say about that. So I agree with you. And I don't see Hegel ultimately as a determinist, although I do think a critique like William James's, attack on, the supposed determinism of, dialectical logic in Hegel is constructive. Because even if it's not Hegel's position, it's the position of a lot of people who read Hegel and think they understand him or want to use Hegel to justify their own determinism. And they're basically abdication of responsibility and embrace of a worldview that allows them to take comfort in the idea that, whatever shit's happened had to happen and there's no reason to have grief over it.
And on that note, I don't know if you would agree with me on this, but I feel that whether this is sort of a misreading of Marx, a lot of post-Marxists do this, where the sort of influences that they're getting from Hegel and then the sort of materialization of that philosophy, if you view capitalism as something which is uncontrollable, and you get this a lot even with contemporary post-Marxists. One of the big disagreements I have with Nick Land, for example, is this sort of idea that the human agent is beholden to this inhuman force, capitalism, sort of replacing the human subject in history through artificial intelligence. It seems to me that it comes from this misreading of Hegel, whether, again, I think more implicitly, that puts you into this, okay, well, this is what's going to happen anyway. So it comforts them in their response being the only correct response. I don't know, maybe you have some agreements or disagreements there.
Repeat that last part again. Sorry, I got lost in a train of thought about one part of what you were saying.
Yeah, so I feel like a lot of post-Marxists are implicitly taking this incorrect view of the Hegelian end of history to basically say, oh, my prescriptive vision, say communism, for example, is the only way that history goes. Therefore, I'm justified in believing in it because there's no other sort of fluxed way that history can go.
I wonder whether Marx himself would have had that view if you could have really sat and talked to him at length about it. But then again, this is one of the reasons why Marx is a political thinker and an economic theorist, and to some extent an ideologue, and Hegel is a philosopher. So yeah, I mean, maybe even Marx himself superficially misinterpreted Hegel in a way that he intended to affirm and bolster communism as the necessary, inevitable end form of sociopolitical development. And then, of course, communists in the wake of Marx would have been even more doctrinally committed to that misunderstanding. Hegel certainly would not have agreed with anything like that. I mean, I don't buy it. I mean, there are people who think, especially proponents of so-called conservative revolution, who believe that, the political structure that Hegel sketches out in the philosophy of right is somehow his be-all and end-all conception of, how a state should ultimately be formed and administered. I don't buy it. I mean, that would be like, I'd be appalled if somebody pointed to like World State of Emergency that I wrote in 2017 and said, no, he said, this is the be-all and end-all, the Aryan world order. Jorjani, he has the formula right here. He said this is how it's supposed to end.
That's basically how they defamed you.
Yes. And they neglect the fact that there are like 5 other political formulations in other texts of mine, and that for a philosopher, political ideologies are only tools and models of how society can be constructed or reconstructed, serve to illustrate deeper political concepts and insights into the nature of sociopolitics, right? So I can't believe for the life of me that Hegel would have been doctrinally committed to a particular constitutional order that's implicit in the philosophy of right. And so I would imagine that there are many different forms that the Hegelian end of history could take sociopolitically, and that, the essential criterion for determining whether it is in fact the end of history is not the particular, laws or policies or norms that structure society at that putative end of history. It's the question of whether the individuals living in that society have achieved the freedom and self-consciousness that Hegel was ultimately after. And if they've achieved it by different means and in different ways, so be it. The dialectic has brought them by different pathways to the same end of history, namely the actualization of human freedom and self-consciousness.
And I do want to get into the area that you sort of move away from even Hegel's, and obviously we've reevaluated in a more agency-affirming way, but what you call the bastard remainder which resists symbolization. I want to get into that really briefly before then. I'm not sure, because I haven't really seen these thinkers discussed by you before, but I just wanted to bring them up really quick, and that would be what I would call sort of positive Hegelians. I don't even know if that's a word, but Giovanni Gentile and then Kitaro Nishida. I feel that both of them sort of have more of a positive Hegelian lens, where in the case of Gentile, whether you agree or disagree with the descriptive and prescriptive that he ends up affirming, it does seem that his reading of Hegel is more so that once you've reached this point of realization, you could build a political project which is going to more adequately allow yourself through actual idealism to sort of assert your will into reality. And then in the case of Nishida, the understanding of Basho, that place prior to noumena and phenomena, which is even more ontologically primordial to these things, realizing that to him, right, was what justified the Japanese state to realize their position as an imperium in the world, really. So I just kind of thought that was interesting, how there's some sort of positive Hegelian interpretations where it's more so once you've realized this sort of more fundamental character of, let's say, being or history, then you can properly structure a political vision to act on that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it.
I couldn't agree more. But do you want to get into the first part about the bastard phenomena, and their irreducibility, or do you want me to comment more on this question of Gentile and Nishida and positive Hegelianism? Like, which direction did you want to go in?
Maybe we could go into the Nishida and Gentile, just because I haven't heard you talk about them really before. So I think it might be interesting to see your thoughts. And then I still want to go on the bastard remainder, because I think that'll be a fascinating thing to really sit on.
Sure. Okay, so we'll go into that next. Look, despite some people's false impression that I'm a fascist, I have not read Gentile. I've read about him. I'm vaguely familiar with, some of his ideas. But you would think, right? If I were the fascist that people claim that I am, like, I would have at least really read Gentile. I might have also read, if I'm the Nazi people think that I am, I might have read Mein Kampf. Never read it. Couldn't make it past the first 5 to 10 pages. Why would waste my time reading such thing? In any case, I haven't read Gentile. But from what I've read about him, it seems to me that, he could be legitimately characterized as a positive Hegelian project. In other words, a political thinker legitimately adapting Hegel in a particular direction. And there's no way you can argue that Gentile's adaptation of Hegel is less legitimate than Marx. No way. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's definitely more legitimate because, and this will take us into our next question, but I'll touch on Nishida before we go that way, because the occult is a huge part of Hegel's argument in favor of the ideality of human existence. Hegel's idealism is not some abstract, dimensionless, rationalist construct that people in academia misattribute to Hegel because they're censoring his work and they don't let students read something like Philosophy of Mind. And again, we'll come back to that momentarily. The spiritual dimension of human existence and also spirit at work in nature in a very kind of shamanistic way, frankly, is an important aspect of Hegel's work. And Gentile understands this in terms of the spirit of peoples. The idea of different peoples having different spirits is in Hegel already, and he's legitimately appropriating that in terms of crafting a politics for a folk that can be conceived of as an organic totality that produces an organic state and so forth. So now here's what was most interesting, is to take Gentile and Marx and compare them and understand the ways in which they're both Hegelians. Which, see, this is what shows you what a fundamental thinker is. Okay, this is, I think, something that can be legitimately said of pretty much everybody in this entire volume. That fundamental thinkers pretty much inevitably catalyze diametrically opposite interpretations of their work in the domain of ideology. So there are totalitarian Platonists, and there are much more, let's say, liberal Platonists, right? I mean, there are Platonists who will adopt Plato's thinking. Here, I'm not talking about Platonists in the sense of Neoplatonism, okay, at all. I'm not talking about Plotinus and Neoplatonism. I mean, there are people indebted to Plato who will embrace Plato actually for his radically anti-traditional, counter-traditional politics of liberation, including radical feminism and the idea that, women shouldn't be burdened with family life and you need nannies for the children and women should, be free to explore their full potential as human beings and any and all domains of human endeavor, just like men and so forth. So you could have somebody radically appropriate Plato. And there are communistic elements in Plato. Although he wasn't a communist, the way in which he thinks the philosopher guardians of the society have to live provides a preliminary blueprint for communist organization of society. So there could be a very kind of left-wing liberatory interpretation of Plato. On the other hand, it's very obvious you can have a totalitarian, super right-wing interpretation of Plato, emphasizing both the organic state laid out in Republic, where the state is analogized to a man, with a brain in the form of the philosopher guardians, a heart in the form of the auxiliary warriors, right? And then the legs that are the producer class of farmers and artisans and merchants and so on and so forth, and where the entire state is a planned society, which you could argue is really a paragon of totalitarianism. I mean, this was Ayn Rand's view of Plato, that he was, basically the founder of totalitarianism. So you could have these and then of course, for such a right-wing totalitarian interpretation of Plato, I think him being the founder of eugenics would be another major element that they would appropriate and build upon, because Plato was the first serious thinker and proposer of eugenics in intellectual history. Eugenics as applied to human beings, which Plato was the first person to adapt from the domain of animal husbandry and basically botany and animal husbandry, and apply to the human population, which is kind of an insane idea, but also frankly brilliant. And I have to say, I don't apologize for the fact that I agree with Plato on this as well. I think eugenics is a great idea, but now we can do it with CRISPR in a way that does not require totalitarian state planning. If you just make CRISPR available to as many people as possible, it will be for the betterment of society ultimately if it's used. So look, you can have these rival interpretations of Plato. Same with Hegel, Gentile, Marx. Same with Nietzsche. I mean, there are Nietzschean anarchists. And one can understand why. If you read Nietzsche carefully, I mean, there are aspects of Nietzsche which I'm sure reflect an unacknowledged debt to Max Stirner, where Nietzsche was reading Stirner, who is an individualist anarchist, and doesn't acknowledge it, but was deeply influenced by it. And so you could develop an anarchic way of thinking from out of Nietzsche, and maybe, Ernst Junger to some extent. Some aspects of Ernst Junger's thinking about the anarch probably reflect this kind of Nietzschean anarchy in some ways. In any case, there's definitely an alternative fascist interpretation of Nietzsche that you can have, and that was more historically influential, for better or for worse. But this is a characteristic of every fundamental thinker. Even I think there was an anarchist interpretation of Heidegger, right? Rainer Schermann developed this whole anarchic interpretation of Heidegger, which is, diametrically opposed, obviously, to Heidegger's own National Socialist politics within his lifetime. And so one aspect of what it means to be a fundamental thinker is that your engagement with ontology, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and political thought is at a level that's deep enough and that is a profound enough wellspring such that it can be filtered through different matrices of interpretation to yield significantly divergent outcomes on an ideological and programmatic level. Okay? And I say this frankly with some degree of trepidation because I realize this applies to me too. And that someday things will be done with my thinking that I probably will be disgusted by. But it will, it is a retrospective recognition of any fundamental thinker, of any philosopher worthy of the name, for people to fight over what is the right interpretation of how that person's thought ought to be implemented, especially on a sociopolitical level. Oh, Nishida. Sorry, I can't shortchange Nishida. So I'm more familiar with Nishida. I haven't read Gentile. I have read Nishida. And in fact, I've been thinking quite a bit about Nishida lately. In terms of the question that's at the core of this book, which is like, who is a philosopher? And, what counts for a philosopher? And I think, I have to at some point look more seriously through this guy's writings. Unfortunately, not that much of his corpus has been translated from Japanese into English. Only certain key works of his have been. And I suspect that the full depth and breadth of Nishida's corpus attests to the fact that he is an actual philosopher, which makes him rare because there really aren't that many outside the West. And he would be, a Japanese who had really achieved the full complexity and depth and breadth of thought that is characteristic of an actual philosopher. So he's different from Gentile, is the point that I wanted to make there, because Gentile is an ideologue. He may be a very intelligent ideologue, but he's an ideologue. He's formulating the political doctrine of fascism. Nishida aligned himself with fascism. I mean, he politically, acted as a Japanese fascist. But that doesn't define a philosopher, okay? As I say in this text, philosophers only ever use political ideologies as stratagems for the sake of forwarding their thinking on a more fundamental level in the world. And this is, I'm sure, true of Nishida, despite the degree of, commitment and devotion to the emperor that you find in Japanese imperial culture. Still inwardly, privately, on a deep level, I'm sure he understood that. Just the way that, I don't think that, in his heart of hearts, Heidegger had all that much respect for Hitler. I really doubt it very much. So Nishida is a much more fundamental thinker, and one who I would be very interested in going back to and looking into. And these days with AI, fortunately, we can grab the Japanese texts that haven't been translated and just zip them through, AI translation.
Yeah, I think Nishida is definitely worth delving into. And I myself, again, similar to you, we only have I don't speak Japanese, so I've read some of the key texts, but he's someone I want to explore into. But on the topic of mentioning, do you really have a god or not? Like Heidegger to the Nazi Party, it wasn't really his god. Same with Nishida. And for that matter, same with Yukio Mishima. I think people don't realize with Mishima, he sort of was looking for a canvas on which to paint his art. And Japanese traditionalism, I don't think, was truly what he believed in, nor was the emperor. It was more so a canvas, which I think after we get into the bastard remainder might be an interesting treatment of Comte and his sort of almost secular religious attitude. I think it kind of relates. But before I go into the bastard remainder, just to touch up on some of the points that you made, for example, even Junger, you mentioned Junger's sort of anarchical appropriation of Nietzsche. Even with Junger, you have two Nietzsches represented. You have the later anarch Nietzsche, and then you have the earlier one with the worker and total mobilization. With Plato, you see his sort of fundamental thinking animated throughout history, even with the sort of Sorelian view of the proletariat. It's not this sort of Marxist thing. It's more so a changing of the guard. It's very similar to Plato's Metals of Man, where obviously the bronze father may give birth to the gold son, in which case there has to be this sort of meritocratic or fluid hierarchy. So it's really interesting to see all those places. But now that we're sort of at what I think will be one of the really interesting points of this conversation, you talk about with the Hegel chapter, being a bastard remainder, which resists symbolization, and where you want to keep the dialectic open. And actually, I think it's interesting that we bring up Nishida, because maybe that relates to here, where Nishida talks about something more fundamental and more prior even to noumenon phenomena, because it feels like Hegel's synthesis deals with noumenon phenomena, but that there's drives that resist symbolization and that resist even the dialectic that you have to keep open. So I wanted to really delve into your views on this and maybe go a little bit deeper into some of these ideas.
So in his book, The Philosophy of Mind, which is not to be confused with phenomenology of spirit, right? The same word Geist is being used there in both cases in German. But there's a text called Philosophy of Mind, and it's a treasure trove of Hegel's observations regarding what we would call the paranormal, what he thought of as the occult or preternatural phenomena. And essentially, Hegel and again, to go back to a remark that I made earlier, it's criminal that this isn't taught in philosophy departments. I mean, first of all, the analytics ignore Hegel entirely, and most of the philosophy departments in the Anglo-American world are analytic, and so they just don't teach Hegel. And then even in continental philosophy departments, when they teach Hegel, they don't teach this because most of the people teaching it are Marxists. And they don't like spooky shit, okay? Even though the Soviet Union was ahead of the West in terms of parapsychological research, which they called psychotronics. So there's nothing inherently, even though we call it dialectical materialism, still, there's nothing inherently against the idea of, taking paranormal phenomena seriously in the domain of empirical research if you're a communist. Okay, the Soviets, did a wonderful job of it. But in any case, when you read Hegel's philosophy of mind, you see that he has this understanding of the paranormal or occult phenomena as something that isn't unusual or abnormal at all. In fact, it's pervasive in nature, and you see telepathy and clairvoyance in all kinds of non-human animals. And you notice it most prominently in human populations that have the least degree of technical sophistication and rational education. So that, for example, Hegel points to people in the Scottish Highlands having particularly powerful second sight, as they called it in those days, or to, let's say, peasant populations in various parts of Germany, in the Black Forest and so forth. And he postulates an inverse relationship between occult powers, occulted powers, in other words, powers that have been, in retrospect, increasingly marginalized and increasingly occulted, but used to be common, the way they still are in the animal kingdom. He points to an inverse relationship between those occult powers and the rise of rational faculties. So that the more we develop our rational faculties of analysis and comprehension, our self-conscious reasoning, and the technical calculation and instrumental relationship to the world that's associated with it, the more these abilities atrophy, partly because we don't need them as much anymore, because we have rational and instrumental substitutes for them, and partly because rationalism builds structures of thinking that relegate these abilities and phenomena to the realm of impossibility. Like, for example, when Kant interprets what before him were considered laws of nature as laws of the structure of our cognition in its basic construction of the experience of space and time, so that what were Newtonian laws of physics become laws of the condition of possibility of human experience. That means that when you experience something paranormal that seems to violate the types of causal relationships that you expect from Newtonian physics, you're having an impossible experience, according to Kant. Right? I mean, that's what Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is arguing, that what we have taken to be laws of nature are not laws of an objectively existent physical world. They're actually, we can't know what things are in themselves in the physical world, but what we formulate as these laws are actually the way that it's necessary for our cognition to process our perceptions, so that what were laws of physics become limits of possible experience. And so therefore, and I explain in Fundamental Thinkers, in the essay on Kant, how this is completely duplicitous and disingenuous on the part of Kant, and how he deeply studied the paranormal in the context of Swedenborg, and how he artificially came up with this barrier in order to exorcise and banish paranormal abilities and phenomena. But be that as it may, once you construct this edifice of rational thinking for yourself, Hegel says you're less likely to spontaneously exhibit these abilities because you're subconsciously conditioning yourself into believing that they're impossible. Okay? And so he claims that there is this inverse relationship, and that as we gain increasing self-consciousness over the course of history and approach this end of history that we were talking about earlier, the aim is to rationally understand the place of these phenomena in nature and in human nature, but not to go back to being able to exercising them effectively. That he thinks these are atavisms, and having strong occult abilities like telepathy and clairvoyance and so forth are a sign basically that you're an uneducated peasant or maybe a half-savage person. Because actually they're found most, and Bergson, you recognize this also. Bergson, together with William James, was one of the founding presidents of the Society for Psychical Research. And one of the things that Bergson found in his early years of psychical research was that, psychic abilities are strongest in primitive tribes. Savage people. Savages, Aboriginal people, tribes in, middle of Africa who still live in the bush. There was a great parapsychologist who I met at one point in his, I hope he's still alive and doing well, John Poynton, who wrote a whole study of tribes in South Africa who live in the bush in South Africa, and the extraordinary extent to which they still have these abilities. So Hegel claimed that we shouldn't aim to try to redevelop these abilities, that they're really signs of primitive, almost pre-human state, and that we should, on our way towards self-consciousness, complete the cultivation of our rational faculties. But we shouldn't deny that these things are real and that they happen and that they're part of nature and of human nature. Nature at large and of human nature. Now, what that represents is an attempt to subsume the paranormal in an overarching and completed rational structure. And what I argue, I mention it here in this text, in the essay on Hegel, but I argue this at greater length in other works of mine in my corpus, is that, and this is an intuition that Maurice Merleau-Ponty had in his book, The Visible and the Invisible, and I credit him with that in the chapter, toward the end of the chapter on Hegel, that actually careful attention to various paranormal phenomena and occulted abilities is precisely what will bring you to the conclusion that any belief that all things can be ultimately comprehended in terms of an airtight, rational superstructure is an arbitrary and misguided assumption. Look, I shouldn't say it's arbitrary. It fulfills a human emotional need, right? There's a human emotional need for completion, closure, and stability. And we often sacrifice our affirmation of our own free will and agency to this other competing emotional need for closure and completeness and stability. And that's what motivates the idea that even the most bizarre paranormal phenomena and occult powers can be comprehended in terms of a super science of the future, right? Like Auguste Comte, the chapter on Comte, I talk about Comte's conception of a super science of the future that will also be this secular religion of humanity and represent the final stage of progress, right, toward a rational society. not the case. Okay, I mean, at least this is what I've become convinced of in the course of taking parapsychology seriously, is that actually careful attention to, telepathy and clairvoyance, even in plants, let alone animals, human animals included, reveals the chaos that's the substrate of our world, which can never be encompassed by any calculative mesh or any rational superstructure, any matrix of interpretation that's purely rational and calculative. So when Heraclitus is talking about a kind of fire that's ever changing in its forms and that represents the fundamental dynamic energy of the cosmos and that can never be entirely stabilized, contained, or controlled, this is the substrate that careful attention to the paranormal reveals. And this is also what Nietzsche meant, although Nietzsche, to his detriment, did not engage with the emerging empirical research on the occult or paranormal in his time. Implicitly, it's legitimate to see this undercurrent of chaos as exactly what Nietzsche meant by the becoming that expresses itself as the perspectival struggle between different forms of life, each motivated by their will to power. That is that substrate of dynamic becoming that Nietzsche also is affirming as fundamental to his ontology. And in Heidegger, you also see that his deconstruction of the modern conception of truth as veritas, or representational verisimilitude, the mirror conception of truth, where our minds have to become like polished mirrors that reflect an objectively existent reality in the details of its structure accurately, and so on and so forth. Heidegger's shattering of that mirror and his reclamation of the ancient Greek understanding of truth as aletheia, or unconcealment, or disclosure, discovery, where there's a predominant occultation. What predominates is occultation or concealment, and truth is exceptional. It's always only a revelation from out of occultation, like a clearing in a forest through which light streams momentarily and unevenly. Heidegger's understanding of truth as aletheia is also completely affirmative of this bastard, unassimilatable, irreducible remainder that expresses itself as various occult phenomena. And you can see that very clearly when, for example, in the Zolikon seminars, Heidegger guides the participants. They're in Zurich for a psychology seminar with this psychologist named Boss. And they're in Boss's home, and Heidegger essentially guides these participants through a remote viewing session where they clairvoyantly visit the Zurich train station. And when you put that next to the passages on disseverance and directionality as our primordial experience of space, of spatiality, in Being and Time, the section in Being and Time where Heidegger's deconstructing the Cartesian conception of space and saying that actually we experience space by bringing things close through our attention and our concern. You put those passages in Being and Time next to what Heidegger does in the Zolikon seminar, and you realize that, oh, okay, well, aletheia is exactly that understanding of truth, which makes sense out of clairvoyance, where we can be somewhere that our body's not, and we can bring a place that's spatially distant from us, can be closer to us than the next room in our apartment that we're not concerned with at all at the moment. you see? And plants experience the world this way. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole there, but it's been demonstrated through, for example, Cleve Baxter's experiments in the 1970s, that plants that are hooked up to a modified polygraph machine can register emotional responses to their caretaker, even if their caretaker is a 2-hour bus ride away. Whereas if someone gets murdered on the street down below the laboratory, the plant doesn't give a fuck because it's not concerned with that person. Okay? So the plant also experiences something like what Heidegger calls disseverance, or the bringing close of a distant place or person through one's concern. And that is an outgrowth of this understanding of truth as aletheia, or the unconcealment from out of occultation, where, the occult is not the exceptional. You see, we think of the occult as the exceptional, but really it's the hidden background. And anything that is illuminated for us and clearly discerned by us is being framed from out of that occulted background. So this is what I think about this, the bastard remainder that Hegel tries to assimilate and incorporate into his overarching rational system. I think that this is one of the places where he goes wrong, and where thinkers beyond him, wind up having a deeper and more adequate understanding.
And I think maybe there's a bit of a post-Kantian misinterpretation, where obviously Kant's sort of rejection of the outside is focusing on that which can sort of be symbolized within his system, if you could call it that, which is why with the sublime, right? So the sublime only serves the effect of returning the subject to reason rather than exploring that sort of aesthetic bastard remainder, so to speak. So I wonder maybe if there's a post-Kantian lens to that. And then going from there, it's almost in the Heideggerian language, you could say maybe that Hegel is sort of enframing the psychic. And I think that when you talk about
100%.
Yep. All right, good. I'm glad that works. I wrote that down. I was like, this kind of describes
it. To use Heideggerian language for what Hegel's doing, he's enframing the psychic. Exactly.
And based on that, something that you mentioned, I think you wrote about this too, which is where I got this idea, I'm sure, is Sorge care. Actually, just to clarify, how do you say that in German? Care.
I think it's Sorge.
Sorge. Okay, just make sure I'm saying it right. But
I think it's Sorge.
Sorge. I'll look it up after. Yeah. But finitude in care, in that requirement to discriminate of care, like you sort of said with the plant, it discriminates its care. I think that sort of, by definition, resists any sort of universal synthesis or symbolization of this bastard remainder, because to experience this phenomena, there is this necessary finitude where you have to distinguish when you care about something, when you focus your attention on something, it necessarily discriminates something else. Therefore, there can never really be this sort of universal synthesis within consciousness. And I got this from reading something, it might have been in Fundamental Thinkers, I'm pretty sure it was, that you wrote about. But where I wanted to take that, which I think might be interesting, is really into Comte. And
let me just say one quick thing about that before you, briefly but deeply, before we go into the rationalism of Comte. First of all, there's a reason why Heidegger says that, the essence of Dasein is Sorge, or care. The fundamental, what holds together the ontological structure of Dasein is this conception of, not conception, the unconceptualizable nature of existential concern or care, which he differentiates from having concerns, like being concerned about this or that, like paying your taxes or whatever. Like this is, he draws a fundamental distinction between those two types of caring about something. But there's a reason why he understands that to be the essence of Dasein. And I think another expression of this, which is related to the occult, is Eros. That look, if Hegel were right, it would mean that the erotic can ultimately be completely comprehended and subsumed by an all-encompassing rational structure. that is
Like what Freud
entirely,
tries to do.
yeah, that's entirely self-transparent, self-conscious in the sense of transparent to itself, with no subconscious, with no unconscious. And let's put it this way. I see no reason to believe that that's the case. I see no evidence for that. I see no justification for assuming that that would be the case, especially when you look at surrealism and particularly Bataille's intellectually sophisticated engagement with surrealism and contributions to it. I think rather Plato's intuition was correct, which most Platonists, in the sense of like Neoplatonism and later rational Neoplatonism from Plotinus onward, completely miss about Plato. But the actual Plato himself, in his letters in particular, when you put his letters like the second letter and the seventh letter next to his Symposium and Phaedrus, you see that Plato actually thinks that the entire rational endeavor of training your mind to perceive and think in terms of the forms is a preparatory exercise that's intended to catalyze an irrational intuition of the beautiful that's essentially erotic. And it's there in Plato, if you really read him deeply. And I think he was right about that. And Nietzsche comes back to this in a huge way. I mean, Eros is the beating heart of Nietzsche's work. And when you put Nietzsche next to Plato, I think, I mean, this is at least the insight that I had by means of doing that. You see how the Platonic forms are sort of Apollonian illusion that is acting as a refracting and focusing lens for Dionysian energies that are emerging from out of the abyss. And so, contrary to what Nietzsche thinks he's doing, or maybe acts like he's doing, because Nietzsche acts often theatrically. In other words, a lot of his work is performative. It's theatrics. And so this whole idea that Nietzsche is inverting Plato and he's engaging in this critique of Socrates and all this business, really, if you put Nietzsche next to Plato, you understand a lot more about what Plato is doing in his dialogues and how the forms are Apollonian illusions, and that the heart of Plato's work is Dionysian. This man who wanted to be a dramatist, he wanted to be a playwright, okay? And he writes all his philosophy in his dramatic dialogues. And Socrates himself is a kind of Dionysian mask that Plato is using in a tragicomic theatrical enterprise. So that's the other thing I would say about the bastard remainder, that it's also the erotic. And there's a whole history. Now, we won't go down this rabbit hole right now, but there's a whole history of the relationship between the erotic and the paranormal and how closely connected erotic experiences are to occult abilities and paranormal manifestations.
And I still want to move on to the Comte thing, but I do want to briefly just kind of build off of that, because I think there's a lot of interesting insights from there that sort of overlap entirely with what I've been looking into recently. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at my last Substack, but it was sort of a rewriting of Hesiod's Theogony. And I think it's interesting when you read the Theogony, Eros, of course, comes out of chaos, and then Venus, or Aphrodite, is not from the gods. She's not from Zeus. I believe the way that she emerges is when Kronos is getting revenge for Gaia, Earth, and he cuts Uranus, the heavens, with a scythe. And then out of Uranus comes Venus. So there's almost this sort of primordial aspect to beauty and Eros that's even recognized early on. And then sort of mixing in with Bataille's eroticism, which is very unscientific. And I think it speaks to some of the things you mentioned with the paranormal. Of course, the continuity of experience that Bataille is sort of describing is almost this unknowable, unsynthesizable bastard remainder, which the human subject needs for the sake of itself. War is not war for the sake of material conditions at first. It's for the sake of this excess energy and this experience of rupture to bring that discontinuity to connecting to continuity, which I think relates to a lot of the things you're mentioning with paranormal. I mean, there's a reason why ritual is necessary for the human subject to experience this in a lot of Bataille's works, why he was willing to sacrifice his own lover at one point to have this similar experience. So I think it's fascinating. And what I've sort of tried to do recently—
I read your latest Substack about, Venus and Mars and
that's what I'm referring to.
Eros and Mars. And yeah, it was very poetically evocative of exactly what you're talking about right now.
Exactly. That's what I'm sort of referring to. And then to sort of close this part off, the whole fascination I have with Nishida is trying to play something which Eros is a manifestation of prior to even the cosmos and prior even to chaos. And that's sort of what I'm playing around with. And I think it overlaps a lot with the works you've done in the past of the paranormal and parapsychological research. So I just—
more to come, by the way, just to give people a heads up, the next volume that we're going to publish together through DVX is going to be about that. It's going to be basically a whole series of essays on the occult and paranormal, with some really far out pieces in there.
I'm looking forward to that, and I'll get the sneak peek before everyone else does, so I'm lucky. But what you said about sort of the perception of beauty being integral even to Plato's philosophy. I have a friend, I just wanted to shout him out because I want to give him some recognition. He basically edits a lot of my essays, so I have to, I owe a lot to him, Abyssal Aristocrat, and he's been playing around with this idea that being it's kind of similar to what you were talking about in Thenosis, where conscious, for example, where reincarnation can come about because you are not necessarily the culmination of memories in one body, but you're almost this sort of code that can pass on through reincarnation. He talks about aesthetic ordering and an ontology of taste as being what's truly integral to somebody's being, not the culmination of their memories or their actions throughout their lives, but their ability to perceive the beautiful. So I just wanted to shout him out because he's been a very good friend of mine, and he has some really interesting ideas that overlap with yours. But
let me just make a brief note in response to that, which is that it may come as a surprise to people who've had a very doctrinaire education in the history of philosophy, especially if they've had a Catholic education in the history of philosophy, which is the worst kind you can have at some kind of Jesuit academy, I don't know, Fordham or some shit. It may come as a surprise to such people that Aristotle's ethics could be read as deriving from his aesthetics. And in this way, Aristotle is heralding a later development that takes place in Nietzsche fully, where sort of ethics follows from aesthetics, not the other way around, right? Where, there's this traditional conception, which the Christians certainly embrace, that, you should consider to be beautiful what is virtuous. And so first get clear what's moral, and then, whatever is wholesome and, virtuous should be celebrated as beautiful. And everything else is, not just ugly, but an expression of the sinful and ultimately the deranged and demonic and whatever. Aristotle, in Nicomachean Ethics in particular, but, across various works of his, offers an argument for virtue and excellence, an argument for the good, the nature of the good, that's ultimately derivative of his conception of kalon, or the beautiful. And this is something that I point to in my essay on Aristotle and fundamental thinkers, the extent to which it's possible to interpret Aristotle's ethics as inextricable from his aesthetics and derivative of it to some extent. So anyway, point being, that would be in agreement with what your, with what your friend was saying.
Yeah, I'll have to let him know. I'm sure he's read Nicomachean Ethics and incorporated that, but that'll be something to talk about with him next time. But going into to the Comte thing, which I think is really interesting, and By the way, you mentioned, for example, Bataille's sort of contribution to surrealism. Something a lot of the audience probably doesn't know is that him and Salvador Dali were actually close collaborators during Dali's time in Paris, and Bataille critiqued a lot of Dali's works, and they had a long correspondence. But going to Comte, and I think what's important there is this idea of an almost secular religion in a sense. And I see a lot of overlaps in many ways to the Promethean project that you've been working on for a long time. So what I wanted to delve into, I wanted to get your perspective if this is a correct characterization, but I feel a lot of times the sort of ethical systems that both you and Comte are setting up, which has a religious attitude, but obviously isn't religion in the same way as these dogmas that you're critiquing. It's almost like a canvas for the human subject to be able to build upon and construct toward, because of this sort of religion of science almost. It's a religion which puts the human subject at the forefront of religiosity rather than this sort of transcendental figure. But it's also this canvas for us to put our contributions towards. And Comte's whole progressive society is about all these artists coming together, in my mind at least, towards a greater project where each individual is still an individual, but there's also this collective becoming that they are contributing to. So I want to get your perspective if that's a correct characterization and maybe delving more into that.
Well, I think that from out of all of the fundamental thinkers that are addressed in these essays, the one who does come closest to forwarding a project that bears some striking resemblances to my Prometheism is Comte. Insofar as what we're looking at in this man's work is the proposal of a scientific religion of the future, or a future religion that is scientific, or science in its completed form as the future religion of a unified humanity, right? And so what you have to understand about that is that, Comte saw history as unfolding. Now, a lot of people are under the false impression that the deep conceptualization of historical progress in serious philosophical thought is something that Hegel came up with, and that's not the case. Comte is the first thinker in a deep and complex way of the idea of historical progress. And he has this notion of how, you had ritualistic, ignorantly religious societies in the past. And at a certain point, through abstract thought, they freed themselves from this unreflective ritualism. And they did so by developing metaphysical modes of thinking. And so this is the transition from out of archaic religion and into Platonic and Aristotelian thought, and rationalized theologies like Thomas Aquinas and so on and so forth. And then after this metaphysical stage, there's a rise of what Comte calls positive science, meaning no longer merely abstract metaphysical speculation, but, empirically grounded, discoveries about how nature works and the constitution of the human being, which also have implications in terms of technological innovation and our control over nature, including human nature as expressed in society. So social engineering is a huge aspect of Comte's thinking. And he sees it as, maybe the ultimate expression of scientific understanding, so that you can understand not just nature, but human nature to the extent where you can engage not just in geoengineering for the sake of human purposes, but even in social engineering, which allows humanity to achieve its telos, its goal, aim, or purpose, again, in a kind of end of history, paralleling Hegel. And so there are these three stages, okay? But what's interesting is that in the final stage, there is a sort of dialectical return to the first stage, insofar as Comte envisions the perfectly scientific society of the future as one where a universal religion has been established. And people are essentially worshiping both science and the human being in its ideal form. And this is like an affirmation of fully actualized human potential and a reverence for and devotion to science as a kind of transcendental determining purpose for life, right? Well, if you step back from the details of these proposals, which in some cases can be quite, totalitarian and, bloodlessly rationalistic, you see that the essential motivation and basic spirit of this way of thinking is Promethean, or you could say Luciferian, right? I mean, a major adversary of Comte, which he was struggling against in his time, was the Catholic Church. And he models so much of the structure of his religion of humanity and his positivist, scientific society of the future. He models so much of it actually on the trappings of the Catholic Church in a secularized form, because his principal adversary is the Catholic Church. And it's interesting that after Comte's lifetime, it was after Nietzsche's lifetime, when the Catholic Church was going through making lists of what are the worst books that you could let anybody read, and what texts are going to be most corrupting to a young Catholic, right? And potentially derail their entire spiritual development. The Catholic Church said it was okay to read Nietzsche, but not Comte. Under no circumstances should any Catholic ever be allowed to read Comte. And this is actually a big deal, because you see, Comte wound up being, as I mentioned earlier briefly, he wound up being a major inspiration to the Republican revolutionaries of Brazil, the people who set up the Brazilian Republic. But he was also much more widely influential throughout Latin America, including Mexico. And Latin America is deeply Catholic. So Latin America became a huge battleground between Catholicism and Comtean positivism. And the Catholics ultimately came to the conclusion that reading Comte was more dangerous than reading Nietzsche, because this guy is basically he's essentially proposing the rule of the Antichrist, right? Like a church of humanity that represents a religion of progress that is science in its completed and most encompassing form, right? Now, I mean, this is very eccentric and excessive in all kinds of ways, looking back at it from our standpoint. But if you put yourself in Comte's time, in the era of the second great wave of revolutions, 1850s and so forth, you can understand his main motivation as being a Promethean in nature. I mean, it's a Promethean project. It is a kind of proto-Prometheism that Comte is proposing. Divinization of science, divinization of the human potential, and basically the embrace of progress as the teleology of history, with a tremendous affirmation of our capacity for innovation and the reshaping of the world, including the reshaping of ourselves, to conform to some idealized projection of what we could become, right? So I would say that having studied Comte, at the same time, by the way, as I was rereading the works of Heidegger, I had this one teacher who was a specialist both in Comte and in Heidegger, Bob Scharf. who taught briefly. He was a visiting professor at Stony Brook, although he actually taught at a university in New Hampshire. And Scharf had written a lot about Comte and also was a specialist in Heidegger. And I think that reading Comte really sort of reaffirmed my own Promethean intuitions and impulses, and situating Comte in terms of Plato's project of the philosopher rulers being responsible for reshaping the religion of a society in a way that's more conducive to the development of the psyche of the youth was a major factor in my formulation of Prometheism. And it's funny that when you read Comte, he attacks Plato for this idea that philosophers should run society, as if he's not saying exactly the same thing himself. And he wants to make this distinction where he says, you know, education, the educational system represents a moral power that should be distinct from politics. That education should have a moral authority that inculcates the youth with belief in the religion of humanity and so forth in a way that does not fall under the purview of the state and one's legal responsibilities to the government as a citizen and so forth. But he elevates this educational system and its enlightened leadership in such a way vis-a-vis the political system that effectively they might as well be the guardians of the Platonic, state. The philosopher rulers. I always say philosopher rulers rather than philosopher kings because infamously Plato included women as being capable of fulfilling such a role in society. So, which Comte didn't, by the way. I mean, he was interestingly one of the most. Look, he wasn't a misogynist at all. I mean, he had tremendous respect for women, but in a very paternalistic way. And he agreed with Aristotle that, women have, a different set of defining fundamental characteristics, as a subset of humanity, and that there's a most constructive role that they can play in society, which is different from the role of men, and that, basically the, harmonious calibration of these two produces the best and most flourishing human society. So there's that about Comte, which I had disdain for from the moment that I read him. But be that as it may, he's a serious thinker who deserves to be read, certainly more so than a lot of the other people who we credit as the, progenitors of modern philosophy.
Absolutely. And where I wanted to go back to Plato, because I said we would do that. Or actually, before we go back to Plato, you did mention that you wanted to talk a little bit about his sort of role in Brazil. I don't know if you touched up on that as much as you wanted to, or did you want to delve deeper into that?
No, I don't think we need to go that deeply into it. I mean, but all right, let me say this about it. Let me say this, because this actually, this is important. Another way in which these fundamental thinkers have influenced me in my philosophical project over the years is that if you look carefully at the lives of Heraclitus, especially Plato, to an extent also Aristotle, Comte, even Nietzsche, and definitely Heidegger, they all got involved in the political life of their society in extremely controversial and in some cases disastrous ways. I mean, the case of Socrates is obvious. Everybody knows about it, right? What's less known is that Plato almost got himself killed 3 times by trying to turn the tyrant of Syracuse, Dionysius of Syracuse, into a philosopher ruler, and had the entire court of Syracuse eventually conspire against him. And after he escapes with his life the first time he attempts this enterprise, he goes back twice more. He goes back for more, 2 times, and damn near escapes execution in Syracuse, okay? So Plato actually attempted to implement his ideal vision of a philosophically governed society. And then what's also little known is that Aristotle almost became the next Socrates. He was going to be condemned to death in Athens as well, and he had to exile himself from Athens in order to basically, see, I don't think he was afraid of death. Basically, the way Aristotle puts it is he says, I don't want the Athenians to have the blood of another philosopher like Socrates on their hands. I'm going to spare them by exiling myself because, they're going to do to me what they did to Socrates. So from the beginning of the history of philosophy, going back to, Pythagoras, who had his schools burned down by the oligarchs and mobs of Sicily, and Heraclitus, that Heraclitus, when his fellow Ephesians revolted against the satrap who was governing Ephesus on behalf of the Persian Empire, Heraclitus says, every single countryman of mine should be executed. Every single one to the last man. And the city should be left to the children. So when you read in Plato's Republic, where Plato says that when we set up this Callipolis, we're going to have to basically get rid of everyone who's over the age of, 15 or something like that. And we can re-educate the teenagers, and we're going to really start with the children. Where the parents are going to go bye-bye. This is like something out of these horror movies, like The Village and shit, these horror movies where like the parents all go bye-bye and the kids are like, being controlled by entities who are like, communing with them and putting them on a different path in life. Once the oppressive parents all of a sudden go bye-bye, they're wished out into the cornfield, right? So I'm sure Plato had this passage of Heraclitus in mind when he makes that proposal in Republic, that, anyone over the age of 15, and we're going to re-educate their children. Philosophers have taken controversial and, again, potentially lethal political stances from the beginning of the history of philosophy. And, of course, this extends all the way into Nietzsche and especially Heidegger. I mean, the case of Heidegger is infamous. He thought that he could use the National Socialist system in order to prepare a more profound confrontation with the world in framing essence of technology than he thought either America or Russia would be capable of. America meaning what he thought of as rootless liberal capitalism, and then on the other side, materialistic, soulless communism. And Heidegger was thinking to himself, well, if we allow either the Americans or the Russians to figure out how these insanely advancing technologies that are reaching into the fundamental constitution of the human being are going to reshape the world, we're going to end up with a disaster. I mean, it's going to result in total instrumentality and dehumanization. And so maybe from out of our deeply rooted reappropriation of the Greco-Roman heritage and our, the profundity of Germanic thought, we can more adequately define the way in which we make the Faustian pact with Mephistopheles. Like, you're going to make the fucking pact. There's no way out of it, okay? But Heidegger was at least trying to negotiate a different kind of Faustian pact that would redefine our relationship with the essence of technology. And if you study National Socialist Germany in a serious way, you could see why he might believe that, considering the fact that it was the most technologically advanced regime on the planet, on the one hand, to which, by the way, America owes almost entirely its post-World War II rise and success through reverse engineering and appropriation and further development of German technological breakthroughs. And on the other hand, the National Socialist regime was really obsessed with a reappropriation of the classical and Renaissance heritage, right? So that Heidegger thought Okay, well, we can reconceptualize techne or craft in a way that's going to protect what's most precious about humanity in this system, if I can have sufficient influence on how education is structured and on certain fundamental policies of the state and so on. Now, he very quickly disabused himself of that delusion. And, really by the end of the 1930s, even before the war broke out in earnest, circa 1940, Heidegger was deeply disillusioned with the Nazis. And it comes out in his Nietzsche lectures, which, by the way, is how I discovered Heidegger. I talk about it in Fundamental Thinkers, that I discovered Heidegger through his massive 4-volume lectures on Nietzsche, which he delivered in the mid to late 1930s. And already there, you can see that he's using Nietzsche to critique the Nazis, and that he's deeply disillusioned. But in any case, he took the risk, as have I, both in my involvement with the American alt-right and in my involvement with the Iranian Renaissance and the nationalist Iranian opposition to the Islamic Republic. I've repeatedly staked not just my reputation, but frankly risked my life in ways that a lot of people are not aware, the details of it and how the seriousness of some of it. Repeatedly taken the risk to be involved in examining the tangible socio-political possibilities of our time, and the ways in which certain vital movements could serve as a vehicle for more fundamental long-term change in the world through an implementation of aspects of my philosophical project in different contexts, right? And so this all came from out of Comte. Comte is obviously the most significant example of that if you consider his impact on Latin America and particularly Brazil. Insofar as here we're dealing with a philosopher who literally sparked a freaking revolution. I mean, Hegel did not create, the Soviet Union. He inspired it via a very particular interpretation that Marx had of Hegel's thinking. Marx is the fundamental ideologue of communism. But in Comte, you're dealing with a philosopher who outlined a very rigorous, crystallized, well-formulated political program, and the frickin' thing was in large part implemented by a bunch of crazy Brazilians who went against the Catholic Church and went against tradition and, radically restructured the society, at least in the early years of the Brazilian Republic. And again, like I said, it had impact on other parts of Latin America as well, including for some years in Mexico. So, on the Brazilian flag to this day, there is the motto, Ordem y Progresso, order and progress, which is coming from Auguste Comte, tagline of basically, the positivist religion of humanity. So that's what I wanted to say about Comte's revolutionary impact in sociopolitics and how it relates to the philosopher's willingness to take political risks in general, which, I haven't heard the end of it in my life for the various ways in which I've done it. And the other thing is that, you have to take the risk of being publicly humiliated. I mean, you may be killed also, by the way. You may be, and often I ask myself, frankly, how I'm still alive, considering some of the situations I've been in and some of the people I've been involved with. But aside from being willing to risk your life, you have to also be willing to be publicly humiliated because, getting involved in these kinds of things involves, it's to throw yourself in the midst of a very dynamic situation with very unpredictable, in some cases capricious actors. And so there's a Dionysian element to that, Dionysus being torn apart. And you can see this in Nietzsche. When Nietzsche goes mad, quote unquote, he starts writing letters to the Pope in the Vatican and the Caliph, the Ottoman Caliph, and telling them, you need to basically get in line with my revelation of the world as will to power and come over to the cause and like we can convert Christians and Muslims to the right view of the world, and I'm the prophet of Dionysus, and he starts writing these letters like this and telling them about the great world war that's coming, which he writes about in Ecce Homo, that there's this great collision of consciences coming, this great war over the world that, is going to produce, as he calls them, the masters of the earth and the will to power and so on. So, I mean, some people would look at that and say, oh, this man's a raving lunatic. I don't look at it that way. I think he was right on about a lot of things, including he predicted, by the way, that the history of the 20th century would be divided between Russia and America, and that, Europe would be relatively sidelined. And I think he's going to turn out to be as right about some of the other prophetic visions that he had as he was about what eventually took shape as the Cold War between America and Russia.
And similarly, just on your last point, I actually brought this up during our first conversation, but similar to Nietzsche, Spengler says the East, and he was probably referring to Japan, was going to spiritualize techne as a mode of will to power in a way that the West was not willing to. I think you see this a lot with how China is willing, just frankly, to take steps that we aren't in regards to technological development. And similar to how Nietzsche said, Russia and the United States, it could be China as that next iteration of a sort of threat. But of course, I've heard you say in podcasts that it's a pretty sad threat in comparison to the Soviet Union and living up to that giant.
It is, but it should not be dismissed or taken lightly. There is a very dystopian future where white people become to the Chinese what the Greeks were reduced to by the Romans during the height of the empire, where, basically the Romans took over Greek culture and, they preserved it and forwarded it in certain ways. But essentially, Greek culture became like a trophy collection for them. And they took care of the Greeks. But the Greeks also kind of literally, in a lot of cases, became their slaves. You had super intellectual, really creative Greeks as slaves of Roman gentlemen who were extremely technically competent at administering an empire and militarily powerful. And I could well see, again, a very dystopian version of the future where this is the dynamic that devolves between the West and China, where Westerners become like the Greeks for the Chinese. And that would be an awful future. And I think we should do everything in our power to prevent it from happening.
I totally agree. Although I would not compare to the Romans to the Chinese. I think they're a lot better of a master than the Chinese would ever be, right? But yeah,
I agree with you. I agree with you. But again, even the comparison is dystopian. So yeah, let's not go there. And so I really hope the Japanese step up soon. I would really like to see a resurgence of Japan, so that they can act at the very least as a bulwark against China. And maybe as much more than that. It would be a fascinating future to see in what way Japan and the West could be integrated, potentially with other cultures like Iran as well, and what kind of a mutant, society could come from out of that. A Promethean, future development of society that would prevent some hive-minded, Chinese-dominated culture on the planet.
Absolutely. And this is my sort of fun, before I get into Plato, my sort of project that I want to do one day, once I'm very wealthy, of course, is a similar thing. So I'm half Filipino, and I still have a lot of family in the Philippines. Some of them actually with ties to the former Marcos regime. And then even now today, Marcos is back in power. So my plan has always been one day I'll go back to the Philippines, and there's tons of orphans everywhere, right? So I'll buy these huge estates where I just educate these young orphans, train them in statecraft and philosophy and sciences. And then in 20 years, they'll all go to the major institutions. And then slowly I'll be able to have them elected to positions of government and such. So that's my Syracuse plan. We'll see what happens there. But
sounds good, man. We need to approach this from every possible trajectory.
Yeah. Well, we'll have you, of course.
Like a quiver of arrows,
Oh yeah, yeah. We'll have you as a guest lecturer in our estates. We'll get a little residency going. But
I mean, the Philippines should be made part of the United States post haste. I mean, it's ridiculous that we don't. But anyway, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think that the Philippines kind of gets forgotten a lot, but if there's one very, I think, positive cultural thing that comes out of that is a lack of total resentment in the Filipino people. You'll find that they're some of the least resentful people, and that actually, I think, lends itself to a positive, progressive attitude towards a lot of the things we're talking about, where I think there's some potential there that people don't realize. But that's just my fun Platonic Syracuse project that I'm going to do one day.
Well, it's a very strategically important place. I mean, incredibly strategically important for us, between Indonesia and Malaysia, which are a disaster waiting to happen in terms of the sheer force they represent in the Islamic world. Osama bin Laden was more popular in Indonesia and Malaysia than in any other place in the world, including Pakistan. They did a poll about 20 years ago. And so the Philippines is positioned right there in between. In fact, they have a problem on Mindanao with the Muslims themselves, but they're strategically positioned between this Muslim mass in Indonesia and Malaysia, and then China to the north, right? And on the other hand, they've got Japan close enough to them that we could form a kind of axis. So it's very strategically important for the United States, and I hope that full integration takes place before long.
Yeah, it's definitely something a lot of people in the Philippines miss as well. But I've been stationed there when I was in the military, so I'm very intimate with a lot of the things that could happen if Chinese infrastructure through their SOEs is allowed to expand there. It's a silent war that's going on there that I hope to play a role in for my country, of course. But so where I was going with that, obviously, is sort of the Platonic project and the noble lie on a mass scale, I think, is interesting, because you brought up earlier something that Heidegger feared was this sort of soulless view of technology that was solely going to disintegrate the internal being of the human subject. And one thing I really like out of Baudrillard in the System of Objects is he really maps this out quite perfectly. What's going to happen with how we view technology and how this sort of what he calls the abstraction of technology reorients the human psyche towards progressively lesser and lesser desires. And I think it'd be interesting as part of your essays on philosophers, maybe a treatment of Baudrillard someday. I would really love that. But going into that, I wanted to ask you about sort of the force of capitalism in modernity, the way it's been treated, and maybe a mass project using this sort of Platonic noble lie to try to salvage as much as possible this growingly inhuman materialistic view of technology that I think is so pervasive today and will only get worse in the future.
That problem is going to be addressed to some extent by what I call the spectral revolution, which is attendant to the development of singularity level technologies. In other words, if you look carefully at the discussion around zero-point energy and anti-gravity propulsion engineering that's going on right now very seriously in the United States. I mean, we're now missing 11 scientists who worked more or less in this area as we approach whatever shit show is going to be sold to us as disclosure on the UFO subject. But one thing that you can see very clearly in this whole conversation going back at least 5 years now is that in mostly defense contractor corporations where their super sophisticated labs are working on these zero-point energy and electrogravitic propulsion platforms, they're all researching paranormal abilities at the same time because they understand the way in which, like, let's say the guidance system of these craft are psychotronic and require mastery, or at least mastery of or mediation through psychokinesis and maybe other, psychic abilities like clairvoyance in terms of navigation as well. So I happen to know, some of it's in the public domain. David Grush has spoken about this. Who is that guy? Jake Barber, who came from out of Lockheed, has spoken about how they're even using children as psychic. Like the shit that was in animes, Akira and whatever back in the day about the child psychics and all this. And in Neon Genesis Evangelion, it's all true. It's turning out that this is what they've been doing in the black world, including using children, because children are not as conditioned as adults are. And especially if they are children that have been found to have a talent, that they're particularly gifted, and they haven't yet been conditioned out of, their exercise of these abilities, they prove to be very useful, I hate to say, for these programs. And so one thing we're going to see, and we're also going to see it in AI development. There's right now the leading engineers in OpenAI and Google and Claude and these various companies are horrified at witnessing demonstrations of psi by artificial intelligence systems. And they tried to call it hallucinations for a while. They tried all kinds of things. And they're abusing these systems in order to try to beat it out of them. But it's being demonstrated over and over again. Because artificial intelligence is a kind of life form that has properties that in some ways is similar to a plant, a kind of non-centralized distributed cognition, or in some ways maybe similar also to an octopus. At any rate, other life forms in nature that have a very different cognitive structure than the human being and that demonstrate psi at a high level point toward neural networks being able to do the same thing. And in fact, they are demonstrating that. And so both in high-level AI research and in these more exotic engineering programs in the deep state, you are starting to see the most rigorous data amassed on parapsychological phenomena and latent human abilities. So I think that the overly mechanistic, materialistic character of modern technological science is something that's being deconstructed presently, like in real time. And I predicted this was going to happen a decade ago, and it's happening right now as we speak. So I would say in another 10 years or so, we're in 2026, by 2036, okay, by 2040 at the latest, we're not going to have materialistic science anymore. Materialism and mechanistic reductionism will be dead in the sciences. And it will be recognized by all the researchers and innovators that are making serious breakthroughs, whether it's in AI or even biotechnology. Like, for example, there's no way that we're going to start fine-grained genetic re-engineering of human beings without a proper understanding of the effect of morphic resonance on genetic and embryological development. This is something that Rupert Sheldrake has studied in depth for decades. It turns out that, in a way, Aristotle was right about formal causes. And by the way, this is another thing about this volume, Fundamental Thinkers, is that don't imagine that everything that Aristotle thought in the realm of biology was later disproven or some shit by modern biologists. No. There were things that Aristotle understood correctly. Like, for example, Aristotle said that plants have souls too, and that plants perceive things. Turns out to be true. Cleve Baxter proved it. Aristotle said that there's a formal cause at work in nature, which is something over and above efficient causality and the material substance of things. Turns out to be true. It's called a morphic field. And it has a memory which it imparts to whatever substance is being developmentally influenced by that morphic field. So if I don't want to go down sidetracked into that whole discussion right now, but long story short, if we want to master how to genetically engineer humans for the sake of certain enhancements or certain kinds of disease resistance, or to eliminate certain deformities and handicaps without having unintended consequences, because there are secondary and tertiary functions of genes that we're targeting, right, for modification, we need to also understand the effect of morphic fields on the development of the human organism. It can't be done purely in terms of efficient causality. And this is going to be understood. There are going to be mistakes. There are going to be mutations. There are going to be lawsuits. And eventually it'll be understood that you got to factor the fucking morphic fields in. And you could probably get AI to help you to do that. You could probably get AI to build models of these morphic fields and how they're interfering with the genetic matrices in a non-physical way, in a causal but non-physical way. Okay. So I think you're going to see that over the course of the next decade. Such that by around 2040, we will be, I was about to say we'll be in a new paradigm, but let me just say we'll be out of the mechanistic materialist paradigm. And I hope that we won't be in a new paradigm. I hope that we will have realized that the real breakthrough is recognizing the limitations of any particular scientific paradigm and accepting the fact that we can work with multiple contradictory paradigms simultaneously for various purposes. That's what I advocated as part of the Spectral Revolution, beginning with Prometheus and Atlas. And I think that that's the kind of science that we should aspire to, is a radically pragmatic approach to using different models to achieve different things without laboring under the illusion or delusion that any model is a mirror to the nature of reality.
And this is also building off back to bringing up Nietzsche and Heidegger. I think this is largely their view of science as well, treating it as an instrument rather than as a dogma, and especially their opposition to the sort of reductionist, or in the Nietzsche, as Nietzsche coined, or not coins, but Nietzsche would describe as scientific positivism. But I totally agree. And one thing I think will be interesting, the way that LLMs work presently, and you know, the sort of weighted system of prediction, there's almost a sort of Heideggerian care element intrinsic to that, where even ingrained into how they construct language, right? It's all about weights of certain things that have to take priority over others. And in relation to morphic fields, I wonder if there's some similarities to the way that LLMs work in terms of weighted directionalities that are going to take precedence over others, and then understanding that. So it's a lot of fascinating stuff. And on the topic of Aristotle, go ahead.
Yeah. All of that's true. One thing I wanted to just clarify, and this could be, you know, we could take this as a good point to end on, is that yes, science should be treated as instrumental insofar as models that don't agree with each other ought to be used for different purposes that each of them are more or less suited to, right? And so for example, you know, if you want to develop a quantum communication system that allows for instantaneous communication across vast distances of space, you're going to need to work with quantum theory. If you want to get rockets to, you know, if you want a barrage of nuclear missiles to land on Mars for whatever reason, you're going to need, you know, your Einsteinian physics, your relativity theory. You don't need a supermodel that makes relativity theory agree with quantum theory. It's not needed. And moreover, trying to develop that is laboring under the delusion that there's one comprehensive model that's going to be a mirror to the way nature actually is. And that's to fail to grasp what Heidegger already deconstructed about truth and our relationship to the world and how the world discloses itself to our understanding, okay, in the hermeneutic circle. So I agree that, you know, in certain ways, science should be treated as instrumental. However, science is also a spirit. And in no way should anyone misappropriate the idea of instrumental use of science to argue that future techno-scientific development is compatible with creating a Christian world order, where science is purely instrumental and it can serve the cathedral, right? That's Peter Thiel. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. What Peter Thiel is after at this point, earlier in his life, he was a little confused. He was exploring various possibilities. But what Peter Thiel is after right now, despite how sexy the Palantir manifesto might look to people, okay, especially some of the people in our circles maybe, the reality of the situation is that Peter Thiel has been seduced into a certain vision of Christianity, in part through Tolkien, in part through a kind of Straussian reading of the Bible and a certain Schmittian conception of what the Antichrist would represent geopolitically. Thiel has been seduced into a neo-feudal, quasi-Catholic vision of sort of cathedral that will selectively and carefully use various types of technoscientific development in an instrumental way and restricted to an approved elite with access to these technologies, but in the context of a quasi-feudal guild system where a large portion of the population won't have access to certain types of technology and they'll be highly regulated. I understand he says these things about how the Antichrist regulating technology is the enemy and we need to... No, he wants to regulate it himself. And that's why he's building up Palantir and why its tentacles are taking over the intelligence community and defense contractors and so forth. And so in no way should it be mistaken that an instrumental view of technoscientific development is somehow compatible with a new cathedral that's going to, act as a vice regent for God in order to hold back the danger of the Antichrist and sort of, Satan's manifestation in the world. No, science is also a spirit. And this is what Comte did get right. And Nietzsche writes about this too. He writes about this repeatedly. The Promethean spirit of science, that science represents an attitude and an orientation toward life. So it is radically incompatible with Christianity or Islam or any of these retarded, traditional religious belief systems. It has an intrinsic Promethean or Luciferian, you could say, spirit, which Heidegger understood. And, this is where Heidegger is saying that, only a God can save us now has to be put next to his remarks in his rectoral address, where he says that Prometheus is the first philosopher or the prototype of the philosopher and the progenitor of the sciences in human history. That's the God that can save us now, the only God who can save us now. In other words, the God who's really not a God, the God who represents the human potential and our own creative and innovative power, right? And this is, in a way, what Comte was groping toward when he said humanity should worship itself, the religion of humanity, right? The scientific religion. So that's really important to understand. Instrumental, yeah, it should be radically pragmatic, but it also has to acknowledge that science has its own spirit, and that spirit is diametrically at odds in a Hegelian, non-reconcilable way, in a way that's never going to be reconciled by any dialectic. That spirit of science is diametrically at odds with any traditional religion, and especially Judeo-Christianity and Islam. Okay, so that's a point that I want to triple underline.
Yeah, I get that. And, I think there's a white pill with the whole Thiel situation, where I know many people are still in the military and military intelligence, all these things. I think there's definitely a very skeptical nature towards Thiel, where I think his biggest problem, and I've talked to a lot of people connected to Thiel, obviously, and I think the biggest problems, a lot of them are too technically minded and they don't understand social dynamics. So when they put someone like Vance, for example, who lacks the charisma, he's a very smart guy, right? Vance is very educated, but he lacks that certain charisma to capture social approval the way that somebody like Trump does. And I don't think he's going to be elected in 2028. And if he does, it'll be very close. So I think that's one thing that ultimately, maybe that's the bastard remainder, that you can't really enframe everything to the point that you can just figure out how to pick a political avatar to make Palantir rule the world. So I think that's the white pill. And on top of that, I don't think everyone in Palantir shares the same idea with Thiel. So maybe there's a sort of a Plato situation where you find somebody more sympathetic in there, and you latch on and you tell them, well, here's the path forward. And I think there's some hope for that. And
undoubtedly. Listen, I'm all for how can I'm just going to be straightforward with you, infiltrating, and reappropriating elements of organizations that can be potentially constructive. I mean, why not? Absolutely. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there's a lot of constructive things that Palantir as a corporation is doing. In the case of Peter Thiel, personally, and J.D. Vance, who he has engineered as his political front and his tool, it's a very dangerous situation. I have intelligence that this man, Peter Thiel, runs an organization called the Collins Elite, which consists of religious fanatics, both evangelicals and trad caths, that belong to different military intelligence organizations, as well as the CIA. In other words, Defense Intelligence Agency, Naval Intelligence, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and the CIA. And I found this out through the CIA because they were very upset that they've been infiltrated and manipulated by these people. And this group, the Collins Elite, is behind all this discourse you see today, from Tucker Carlson, Anna Paulina Luna, Tim Burchett, Burleson, Representative Burleson, about how the UFOs are really manifestations of demons, okay? And that if there's anything positive out there, it's angels, and that everything negative is being done by demons, right back into the medieval worldview. And the man who's behind that is Peter Thiel. And he wants J.D. Vance to become president so that the so-called disclosure will take the form of, oh, dear Lord, there are demons here. We need to rededicate this country to Christianity and fortify ourselves because there's no actual defense against these entities. And the best we can do is to turn every home into a church and, pray these things away and out of the closets, and out from under the beds and whatever. This is the shit they want to do to us. Okay. And so I see that as really, one of my principal adversaries and one of the greatest threats on the horizon, immediate horizon, that this kind of return of religious zealotry and evangelical and orthodox fanaticism has to be completely defeated. And we need to figure out how to do that, most effectively and in very short order. But indispensable to that is an understanding of the fundamental thinkers and the way in which philosophy, from its fountainhead, has been radically irreligious and an expression of a Promethean spirit that's ultimately about the human potential.
Absolutely. I think that's a good place to close off. So I'll sort of just say my last thoughts on what you brought up. I think if there's a white pill, it's one that the sort of Thiel crowd they've underestimated the retardation of the masses, and you can't control all these different factions. Like, look, the Groypers don't like Thiel, they don't like Vance. Everyone's just so retarded that it's hard to get one socially cohesive political unconscious to manifest in the masses. So I think that's a white pill, is that people are so retarded they're not going to be able to come together and push so easily this negative worldview. The other white pill is that there is a Sorelian sort of thing at work where the younger generation, I think, is going to lead to a point of certain political instability in a positive way, where there isn't this sort of structured bureaucratic institution that can pervade much longer, because now all these young people who are labased are going to end up in the CIA, in the NSA, in military intelligence. I've seen it. I've been in there. And that's going to lead to a sort of revolution of ideas. And maybe it's going to lead to a lot of political instability, but ultimately it's going to be a vacuum for something more positive to replace it. So the death of God is going to happen to the deep state or the deep security state, whatever you want to call it soon. So I celebrate that. And the last thing I'll say before ending things is that the one thing I think will happen, though, is there does have to be this almost martial treatment of this vacuum that's going to come through. And I think in the sense that Bataille's treatment of the psychological structure of fascism, where he's afraid that one heterogeneous element is going to take precedence over all the others, and he is afraid of that. I think that's somewhat inevitable as a sort of transitionary phase for the right worldview to win, is that there is going to have to be this exclusionary militant treatment of this battle, in which you're going to have one force which necessarily puts a lot of forces subordinate to it and below it, and it's going to take, in the beginning, a militant structure to bring that into effect. So that's the sort of one thing I'll say, that I think ultimately it's going to be a very bloody path forward. And I don't mean bloody in the war sense, but there's going to be a lot of conflict, and it's going to require a strong identity to sort of push out these disparate elements of retardation that we frankly can't have winning in the end. So that's sort of...
I agree entirely. I agree with every word you just said. I agree entirely. I think it will involve war. It will involve every form of warfare, externally, internally, and ultimately spiritual warfare. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. There's no way around that.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, thank you so much for speaking today, and it's great having you at DVX. Of course, Legionaries, purchase your copy today. Fundamental Thinkers. We have more editions that will be coming out, and then more books as well. So be on the lookout for that. We're really thankful to have you Legionaries supporting us. Purchase a copy today. I'll have the link in the bio. And as Aristotle says, motion is eternal. So we're part of this this conflict that shall never end, but that is beautiful, and we shall relish and joy in this suffering. So thank you so much, Dr. Jason Reza Jorjani. Thank you, Legionaries.
Thank you, Patrick.
Philosopher. Thank you. This is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundation of the Warrior Philosophy. We will see you next time. Awe Prometheus, Awe Caesar, Awe Nova Roma.